and just looking at the theme of water, or more or less more the power of water, I suppose, which is why I sort of had Exodus 14 read this morning. We all know the story fairly well. We'll look at that a little bit more in detail later on. But I guess, there's been plenty of talk about water lately, hasn't there? And probably because there's been plenty of it about. It's been nice to have a reprieve over the last few weeks with pleasant warm days and bright sunshine to dry things out, although some strong and rather cold winds for November were quite unpleasant. So 2022 has been an exceptional year, I should say, of rainfall for Sydney. It took only 279 days to break the city's annual rainfall record of 2,194 millimetres. That was back in 1950, over 72 years ago, and that recorded data goes back to 1859, which is 163 years. So it's not really that long, I suppose, our records, as far as our records are concerned, but significant nonetheless. Sydney also saw its wettest 16 days in a row on record from February 22 to March the 9th with 610 millimetres. July was also very wet. The first 5 days saw 212 millimetres, followed our place in Bradbury, easily the wettest few days in the 20 years of living there. The Nepean River at Camden Weir peaked at 12.7 metres on the 3rd of July, isolating our ecclesial hall at Eldersley, but thankfully the water didn't actually affect the hall itself. We know that this rainfall hasn't just been isolated to Sydney and surrounds, but most of New South Wales, Victoria and southeast Queensland. And as I hear this morning, apparently it's also now flowing into South Australia, where the city of Renmark is on alert with the Murray River expected to reach a 50-year peak or something this week, and there's a lot of houses, if they're not already under threat at the moment. We saw the devastation that occurred earlier in the year in the Northern Rivers region, particularly the city of Lismore, where the main street was submerged, and many of our brothers and sisters who live up that way were affected by this extraordinary event. More recently, we've seen towns in Victoria, such as Echuca and Moama, cut off for weeks due to flooding. And again, with another rainfall event about 3 weeks ago, we saw Wyangla Dam near Cowra, which has the capacity, this dam has the capacity to hold twice the volume of water than Sydney Harbour. It was spilling over 230,000 megalitres or 230 gigalitres every day at its peak into the Lachlan River. So this resulted in the devastation that occurred in the township of Eugowra on the 14th of November that was described as an inland tsunami, where 90% of the buildings were destroyed or damaged by a wall of water. And that's roughly a fifth of the town's population. And sadly, we also heard that there were a couple of elderly people that perished in that. There was also major flooding at Forbes and in particular Condobolin, which was of main concern, and particularly for me because those of you may not know, the main Sydney to Perth railway runs through Condobolin, and that has been shut for weeks because of flooding, and that's affected freight getting across to Western Australia. And so it's been a very busy time for me at FedEx with a backlog of so much freight not being able to get over there. In fact, they even had to stop all collections for all freight going to Western Australia for at least a week or two. And at the moment, the railway line is still closed. We don't know when that's going to open. It's supposed to be this month, but we'll have to wait and see. So going back 15 years, I think most of you might have heard this story before, but I'll never forget when Lucy and I returned home from our Moorebank Ecclesial weekend at Long Point in February 2007. We knew there had been heavy rain as it was bucketing down at Long Point on the Saturday night with a heavy thunderstorm, and then again some more heavy rain on the Sunday morning, which is the last day of the camp. And at the time, after a long dry spell, you're very happy with rainfall, and so it was good to have this rain. Until, as we were driving home, we saw it must have really rained quite heavily, because there was puddles all over the side of the road which we hadn't seen in ages. And then anyway, going down our driveway, we saw a water line above the garage door. I thought, oh, okay. Obviously, water has made it into the garage. At the time, didn't seem like a big issue because it's only a concrete floor. But when we realised that the water had risen higher above the actual level of our front veranda, and then straight in under our front door, then it became a little more serious. Opened the front door, and you could see that smell of damp, and you could see that it had gone into the lounge room, had spread into Zamira's bedroom, and luckily the kitchen and so forth was all tiled, so that wasn't too bad. But we had to rip up carpets, and it wasn't a very pleasant time. So we were actually displaced for a little time there. And the funny thing is that, well, ironic, I guess, is that there was another 1 in 20 year storm that occurred. I think it was 10 days later, specifically 10 days later. And again, they called it a supercell, 1 in 20 year supercell centred over Campbelltown. Again, more water through the house. So we even had to put in a second claim to our insurance company, and they said, you might want to do something about your drainage and everything there, because if it happens again, we might not knock back the claim. So we quickly therefore had to get our plumbing fixed, and that's why now if you turn to our place, you'll see some big drains down the bottom of our driveway and on the other side of the house to cope with the rain. And we've had some pretty heavy rain, obviously, since then. And it's coping quite well. So thankfully we managed to get that fixed. But yeah, so rain hasn't been, and water hasn't been too friendly for us in the past. But at least it's really been a blessing in many other ways as well. And so as we know, we don't have to read far into our Bibles to find out about water. In verse 2. In Genesis chapter 1, that says, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Now, earth just being a pool of water, and then the atmosphere was created. In verse 6, God says, well, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. So without that, it would be impossible for any evaporation to occur, and therefore for any rain to fall, even though it had never rained until the time of the flood. As we know, that it was only a mist that watered the earth until that time. So I guess you could say for the first 1650 years of Earth's recorded history, water was only a good thing. But then we get to Genesis chapter 6, the earth was corrupt, and no consideration of God whatsoever. And I think that came out in one of our hymns this morning too. It was a good choice. In verse 5 of that chapter we read, then Yahweh saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And Yahweh was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. So Yahweh said, I will destroy man, from whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping thing, and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I had made them. So God has used water as a punishment for wickedness in the past, but also at the same time to save the faithful, Noah and his family, and we know that this has become a symbol for baptism and the whole meaning of our salvation today. So further in that chapter we read, this is over in 1 Peter chapter 3, where we read from verses 20 to 21, the divine long-suffering waited until the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is, 8 souls, were saved through water. There is also an antitype which now saves us, baptism, not the removal of the filth of the flesh, but the answer of a good conscience towards God, through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And this humble act of baptism is what saves us from eternal death. So perhaps we might like to take a moment just to remember our baptism. My baptism in particular was back in 1995, 28th of March. That's coming up to 28 years next March. And yet I still remember it so clearly. Camden Hall on a Tuesday night, my cousin Glenn Munro taking me through, and this was back in the days when, if you might recall, we're up on the flat platform and they're asking questions, and then people are turning up passengers, which is I guess is a good thing, especially for the audience and for young people in also learning about the truth. But the same when you're up there, at the same time, quiet little me being in front of everyone, it was quite I was quite nervous. I felt rather awkward. But question time came and went. I put my swimmers on, and I stepped into the bath, which was lukewarm. I sat down in the bath. A prayer was said. Was asked the question, "Do you believe?" etc. Went under, put to death my old self. Came up. Everyone sang, "The Lord bless thee and keep thee." I got out of the bath, there were hugs all around, got changed, and as I was about to leave the change room, my Uncle Ray came in and he congratulated me and said, "You'll never forget this night for the rest of your life." And it's so true. And if we all, just stop and think about that moment now when we came up out of the waters of baptism, we do still remember it so clearly, starting a new life. So obviously another significant event which we read of this morning was the crossing of the Red Sea. Exodus 14 verses 13 to 14. And Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand still and see the salvation of Yahweh, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall see again no more forever. Yahweh will fight for you, and you shall hold your peace." And then further down in verse 21, "Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and Yahweh caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night, and made the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. So the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea on the dry ground, and the waters were a wall of them on their right and on their left. And the Egyptians pursued and went after them in the midst of the sea, all of Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen." Now, I think this would have to be one of the greatest and most dramatic miracles in the scriptures. It's no wonder that they've even made a movie about it. There's a movie called The Ten Commandments. It was made a long time ago. But even that, or even today, if they were to try and remake that, even that could not have over-dramatised, the events of what happened in reality. Just trying to picture in our heads together to imagine what it would be like to have witnessed that. So imagine if you're just one of the Israelites fleeing the Egyptians, and there's Moses, he's stretching out his hand over the sea. And we know it was dark because we're told there was a strong east wind that blew all night. But it was only dark for the Egyptians. If you notice that in verses 19 and 20, where it reads there, "The angel of God who went before the camp of Israel moved and went behind them, and the pillar of cloud went from before them and stood behind them. So it came between the camp of the Egyptians and the camp of Israel. Thus it was a cloud and darkness to the one, and it gave light by night to the other, so that the one did not come near the other all that night." So there's this pillar of cloud and fire now behind the Israelite camp, illuminating the area ahead of them. But on the other side of the cloud, just darkness for the Egyptians, so that they could not see what was happening at that time. And so you look ahead, and at first you must be thinking your eyes are playing tricks on you or something, as if the pillar of cloud, fire I should say, wasn't already a miracle in itself to be illuminating the way for the Israelites. But suddenly you're looking out there and you see this gap in the middle of the sea, which becomes a pathway. Each side a wall of water that has been pushed back on either side. Everyone looking around in amazement, and how is this possible? Yet by faith they cross and make it to the other side before the morning watch, when God looked down on the army of the Egyptians as they pursued his people. And we know it was an act of faith because of what we read in Hebrews chapter 11. It's mentioned in verse 29 that by faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, whereas the Egyptians attempting to do so were drowned. So what would be going through your head? It was supposed to be night, but the crossing was lit. A wall of water on each side, left and right, as we're told. It makes you wonder if anyone even might have wanted to wander to the side to feel this wall of water and what's actually really happening here. It's extraordinary when you stop and think about it. And so in verse 23 of Exodus 14, we do read that the Egyptians pursued and went after them into the midst of the sea, all of Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. Now it came to pass in the morning watch that Yahweh looked down on the army of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and cloud, and he troubled the army of the Egyptians. And he took off their chariot wheels, so that they drove them with difficulty. And the Egyptians said, "Let us flee from the face of Israel, for Yahweh fights for them against the Egyptians." And then Yahweh said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, that the waters may come back upon the Egyptians, on their chariots and on their horsemen." Verse 27, and Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and when the morning appeared, so it's now morning, the sea returned to its full depth, and the Egyptians were fleeing into it. So Yahweh overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. Then the waters returned and covered the chariots, the horsemen, and the army of Pharaoh that came into the sea after them. Not so much as one of them remained, but the children of Israel had walked on dry land in the midst of the sea, and the waters were a wall of water to them on their right and on their left. So again, trying to picture this, the sequence of these miraculous events and what the Israelites and Egyptians, for that matter, would have been thinking and feeling at this time. Even visualizing the pillar of cloud of fire, which are like two opposing forces. You've got the fire. We know the fire is one extreme, and the cloud, which I imagine is just water vapor, is the other extreme. And what an incredible moment in history where once again God uses water to preserve life for the faithful, and yet destruction and death for the wicked. So speaking of preserving life, it really goes without saying that water is essential for our survival in so many ways. So we easily take it for granted, and yet we are reminded from time to time, especially here in Australia, where we know we have droughts quite frequently, of the importance of water. I mean, the most recent drought we know of ended in February 2020, which saw the most devastating and widespread bushfires across southeast Australia, and it made world headlines. Scenes from the south coast, which we've never seen before, of pitch black skies around mid-morning, the blanket of smoke that was just so thick, and it would have been very frightening if you're in the middle of that for so many people. Water was so desperately needed to extinguish the fires. All hands were on deck to protect properties. Water-bombing aircraft was called in from overseas. It went on for weeks. As I mentioned earlier, water and fire, like two opposing forces. For months, the fire was winning. And then in February 2020, the big rains came. Water extinguished the fires in most areas, filled our dams to capacity, and the air never smelt so fresh afterwards. The never-ending smoke haze that we had for months no doubt caused so many health issues for so many people was finally gone. and then COVID hit. But that was a time when we really appreciated water. And of course, there's times when we appreciate fire as well to keep us warm. And of course, there's nothing like gathering around a campfire on one of those camps. It is another necessity for life, but it is not the focus of my exhort today. Just a thought. I found a quote in Job which I thought pictures water coming from the clouds quite beautifully. In Job chapter 26 and verse 8, he mentions, "He binds up the water in his thick clouds, yet the clouds are not broken under it." And it is extraordinary to think when you look at the clouds and you see the amount of water that is sustaining them, yet it's not, before it actually rains, there's so much water that is stored up there in the atmosphere, and only when the timing is right, when it gets heavy enough, it falls to earth. So just stop and think about the amount of times you use water every day. You wake up at 3:30 in the morning and you're thirsty. You grope your way to the bathroom or kitchen, trying not to turn any lights on that might wake someone up. You find the tap, turn the handle, fill a glass of water, you drink it, job done. You go back to bed and try and get a few more hours sleep. At breakfast, the kettle must be filled with water to boil, so you can have that all-important morning coffee to start the day. Look outside, looks like it's going to be a nice day outside. Better put some dirty clothes in the washing machine. And what fills the washing machine? We know that it is essential for cleaning, mopping floors, washing dishes, washing our cars. Washing our hands has been a very important reminder since COVID as well. And I'm sure we all remember a time when we're at home or elsewhere and we've gone to turn on the tap and nothing comes out because there's been an issue with the local water supply. It's like, well, okay, what do I do now? Where am I going to get some clean water from? There are so many other miracles in the scriptures that do involve water. After the crossing of the Red Sea, and this is only 3 days, they've been in the wilderness, that they found, the Israelites, they found no water until they came to a place called Marah, where the water was bitter or salty, which is why it was called Marah. So after the people complained about what they were going to drink, Moses prays to God, revealed a tree, which he then threw into the water, and the water, we know, then became sweet or fresh so that they could drink. This way they would know that, as if they wouldn't have already known after the amazing miracle they'd just gone through of crossing the Red Sea, but this way they would again know that God would always be there for them to look after them so long as they listened and did what was right in his eyes. So it's the same for us today as we endeavour to do what is right in God's eyes. He will always be with us on our journey to the kingdom. And ultimately, we will be healed of our disease, which is sin, when we reach that destination, which we know it must be so very close. It's just over that hill over there. We just hold on to our faith for a little bit longer. We pray to God every day to help us and our brothers and sisters to get us through each day, to keep that hope, to keep that vision alive. There's the miracle of Naaman, the commander of the Syrian army who had the disease of leprosy. He was sent over into the land of Israel where he met up with the prophet Elisha, who told him to go and wash in the river Jordan 7 times, so that his flesh would be healed and be made clean. Perhaps the River Jordan was probably dirty like the Georges or Nepean River, and at first Naaman was angry that he had travelled so far to this destination in his condition to be told to go into a river where we thought, well, I could have just done this closer to home where there's cleaner rivers closer to home. But regardless, we know that he washes in the River Jordan 7 times, and as it says in 2 Kings 5 verse 14, his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. After that, Naaman knew that there was no other God in all the earth except in Israel. And that story is from 2 Kings chapter 5, if you want to have a read of that later on. So in Luke 4 verse 27, we read, and many lepers were in Israel at the time of Elisha the prophet, and none of them was cleansed except Naaman the Syrian. Again, in the Gospel of Luke chapter 8 verses 22 to 25, we read of another miracle involving water. In verse 22, Luke chapter 8, now it happened on a certain day that he got into a boat with his disciples, speaking of the Lord Jesus Christ, of course, and he said to them, let us cross over to the other side of the lake. And they launched out. But as they sailed, he fell asleep, and a windstorm came down on the lake, and they were filling with water, and they were in jeopardy. And they came to him and awoke him, saying, Master, Master, we are perishing. Then he arose and rebuked the wind and the raging of the water. And they ceased, and there was a calm. But he said to them, where is your faith? And they were afraid, and they marveled at one another, as you would, saying to one another, who can this be? For he commands even the winds and the water, and they obey him. I guess there have been times in our lives where perhaps we have been caught in a really bad storm, especially while driving, and it can be really dangerous. Maybe we just have our ongoing struggle with the mental storms in our lives. But remember, with Christ at the vessel, we can smile and continue to walk with confidence whichever storms come our way. With our bodies as a vessel that have been baptized into Christ, we really have nothing to fear. But again, it's the miracle of the sudden calming of the wind and water that had his disciples amazed that even the winds and water obey him. And I guess, especially for me after a prayer, when I learn to lean on God and to put my faith and trust in him, there is a sudden feeling after the prayer of calm and not the turbulence of worry which I may have had beforehand. Finally, I like to think of our baptisms as a miracle. And it's a miracle in progress, as we cannot see the immediate effects or really even feel its effect. We all have the same nature as before. We continue to age, and unless Christ comes beforehand, we're all still going to die because we all sin. But what is happening is that we are changing. We are more conscious of sin, and we are slowly being transformed. As we read in Romans 12 verse 2, and do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. The perfect will of God, that he wants us to be a part of his kingdom. We're all doing what we can each day to do that which is pleasing in God's eyes and to help one another. We all have our good years and our bad years of spiritual growth, but overall, we are slowly being transformed. The miracle of us going under the water and coming up again has its completion in the kingdom of God. Whether we're resurrected, which is part of that miracle, or still alive at his coming, by God's grace, immortality will be granted to us. Of course, the whole process of exactly how this takes place, what we look like, how we'll feel and so forth, we really cannot comprehend. But we do read in 1 Corinthians 2 verse 9, but as it is written, eye has not seen, nor ear heard, nor have entered into the heart of man the things which God has prepared for those who love him. I'm just looking forward to continuing God's work with you all, just to ensure that his ultimate plan and purpose with this earth is fulfilled. And that is, all the earth will be filled with his knowledge and glory as, is that word again, as the waters cover the seas. So water, we know, is an essential part of our survival today in many ways, but also an essential for our eternal salvation through baptism. We see how our Heavenly Father uses water to save lives of the faithful, but also destroy the wicked. The miracles convince the faithful that there is one true God who is in control, and reminds us today, when we experience heavy rain and floods, of its destructive power. But we can also see the beauty of water and its power to save. And how blessed we are even today that we have the International Space Station and other satellites that are orbiting the Earth with their high-definition cameras, taking amazing photos of our blue Earth below, its oceans, rivers, the atmosphere. And yet there are some people, believe it or not, intelligent people, who believe that the Earth is still actually flat. Well, it's never been flat. So as we remember Christ now and the bread and wine before us, let us remember some of his words in John chapter 4, verse 14. I just want to conclude with that verse. But whosoever drinks of the water that I shall give him will never thirst, but the water that I shall give him will become in him a fountain of water springing up to everlasting life.